The glass and steel needle of the Ethel Tower pierced the smoggy Los Angeles sky, a monument to the arrogance of men like Carter Hale. Elias Monroe stood at its base, a ghost in a worn-out tweed jacket, feeling the vibration of machinery in his old bones. He was there to pick up his granddaughter, a small errand that had become the highlight of his week. He didn't belong here, not anymore. The foreman, a puffed-up man with a clipboard, confirmed it with a sneer, his eyes cataloging the shabby clothes and the trembling hands. The public viewing area is across the street. Pops. No loitering. It was Carter Hale himself who descended from his glass-walled side office, drawn by the scent of cheap humiliation. He moved through the trailer like a shark, his smile a sharp, predatory thing. "Problem here?" he asked, though he already knew. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over Elias. Lost old-timer? Or just admiring real work for a change? Nora stood slightly behind Hale, her face a mask of professional composure, but Elias could see the flicker of shame in her eyes. She was trapped here, her career held hostage by this man's ego. Hale's gaze fell on the rolled-up blueprints on his desk, a problem he'd been loudly berating his team over. A collapsed section in the sub-level parking design. A smirk twisted his lips. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with condescending mockery, "we have a little puzzle here. Maybe you can help us out. You look like you've held a pencil before." He gestured for Elias to approach the desk. "Come on, give it a shot. Show my team how it was done in the Stone Age." Laughter rippled through the trailer. Nora's cheeks burned. Elias, however, felt a strange calm settle over him. The noise faded. The leering faces blurred. He stepped forward, his gnarled fingers brushing against the crisp vellum. The lines and numbers, the language of his life, began to whisper to him. He saw it immediately, not just a collapsed section, but the reason for it. A misaligned load-bearing calculation, a support column that was a mere suggestion. It was an amateur's mistake, but something about it felt intentional. The error was too glaring, too perfectly placed. He traced a trembling finger along a stress point diagram. "This value," Elias murmured, his voice a dry rustle. "It's incorrect." Hale barked a laugh, pulling out his phone, starting a live stream for his thousands of followers. "Listen up, everyone. The site inspector is on the case. Tell us, old man, what else do you see?" Elias ignored him, his mind diving deeper into the blueprint. He saw another flaw, then another, a foundation grid that was off by a few critical degrees. A falsified soil compaction report referenced in the footnotes. They were subtle, hidden beneath layers of complex engineering, a cancer woven into the very DNA of the building. This wasn't incompetence. This was sabotage, a deliberate, calculated act of destruction waiting to happen. He looked up from the plans, his eyes no longer those of a confused old man, but an architect who had once wrestled mountains into the shapes of cities. He met Hale's mocking gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of uncertainty in the property mogul's eyes. The room grew quiet. The live stream was still running, capturing every moment. "The error isn't a collapse," Elias said, his voice gaining a terrifying strength. "The collapse is a symptom. The disease is everywhere in these plans." He picked up a red grease pencil. "You didn't bring me here to mock a relic, Mr. Hale. You brought me here to witness your murder weapon." And as the red line cut across the pristine blueprint, the first siren wailed in the distance. The siren was for a minor fender bender 3 blocks away, but in the tense silence of the trailer, it sounded like a prophecy. Hale's smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight, controlled fury. The live stream was still active, its viewer count skyrocketing. He couldn't shut it down now without looking guilty. He was trapped in his own spectacle. "An interesting theory from a man who can't even dress himself," Hale countered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The eyes of his staff were no longer mocking Elias. They were fixed on a red mark scarring their perfect plans. Elias was in a trance. The world narrowed to the lines on the paper. "This load calculation," he continued, his finger stabbing at a complex equation. "It's not a miscalculation. It's a lie. You've used a tensile strength rating for static load, but this is a dynamic stress point, right where the main wind bracing converges." He looked at a young, pale-faced engineer. You know what happens to a building that can't sway with the wind, don't you? The engineer nodded mutely. Nora stepped forward, her professional fear eclipsed by a dawning, horrifying understanding. Grandfather? What are you saying? I'm saying this building is a time bomb, Nora. Elias said, his voice raw. And the trigger is an earthquake or a storm. It's a scheduled event. He turned back to Hale. You need a specific report. The Geotech 7B, the one that covers subterranean water table shifts. Where is it? Hale's face was a stony mask. It's irrelevant. We accounted for all that in the initial phase. You accounted for nothing. Elias's voice cracked like a whip. Because the initial phase is built on a lie. This entire site is a fraud. The foundation is misaligned by 2 degrees. On the surface, it's nothing. Over 70 stories, it's a death sentence. It creates a torsional stress that the frame can't handle. You'd have a progressive collapse, starting from the weakened point you so conveniently highlighted. He was pulling on a thread, and the entire tapestry of the Eiffel Tower was beginning to unravel. The staff watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the old man in the shabby jacket dismantled their $1 million project with the ruthless precision of a master surgeon. He wasn't just fixing a blueprint. He was conducting an autopsy. Hale finally moved, snatching his phone and ending the live stream. The sudden silence was deafening. This charade is over, he snarled. You're a senile old man causing a disturbance on my private site. Security. But Elias stood his ground, his eyes locked on Hale. You wanted a show? You got one. And now, so did the city. They heard me ask for the Geotech 7B. They heard me talk about the misaligned foundation. When they come asking, and they will, what will you tell them? 2 burly security guards entered the trailer. Hale pointed a trembling finger at Elias. Get him out of here. As the guards moved to escort him out, Elias didn't struggle. He looked at Nora, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency. Nora, listen to me. The original architect, the one who signed off on the foundation plans before he was conveniently replaced, his name is on the file. Find him. Ask him why he really left. The guards pulled him through the door. Just before it swung shut, Elias called out one last, damning piece of the puzzle, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His name was Alistair Finch, and he didn't resign. He's missing. The drive home was a blur of honking cars and swirling, dark thoughts for Nora. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. Alistair Finch. Missing. She'd worked with Alistair. He was a brilliant, if troubled, man. Hale had announced his sudden resignation for personal reasons 6 months ago. No farewell party, no forwarding address. It had seemed odd, but in the high-pressure world of Hale developments, turnover was high. Now, sitting in her apartment, the pieces were starting to form a terrifying picture. A deliberately flawed design. A missing architect. An accident waiting to happen. Insurance fraud on a monumental scale. It was too monstrous to comprehend. Carter Hale was a bully and narcissist, but was he a murderer? The logic was cold and inescapable. She needed proof. She couldn't access the sealed personnel files, and the original foundation blueprints were locked in Hale's private server. Desperation began to set in. Then she remembered her grandfather's old contacts. There was one man he spoke with fondness, his most gifted apprentice from decades ago. A man who now held a position of significant power. Miguel Ortega, the city inspector. It took 3 calls to get through to his office. When she finally heard his voice, deep and measured, she spilled the story in a rushed, panicked torrent. She told him about her grandfather's humiliation, the flaws in the blueprint, the missing geotech report, and Alistair Finch. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Elias Monroe, Miguel finally said, his voice thick with emotion she couldn't place. He was the greatest mind I ever knew. For him to go to that site, to face that, he trailed off. Nora, what you're describing is not just fraud. It is mass murder waiting for an excuse. Can you help us? Nora pleaded. Can you get the original plans? The ones Alistair signed. I can try, Miguel said, but Hale is powerful. He has friends in this department. A formal request will be buried in paperwork for weeks. We need another way. He paused, and she could almost hear him thinking. There's a city archive, a physical copy of every foundational permit, and its accompanying schematics is stored there. It's a dusty old place, mostly forgotten. If I pull some strings, I can get us in tonight. A wave of relief washed over Nora. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, he replied, his voice grim. If Hale is capable of what you say, then he knows the trail leads to that archive. He knows your grandfather identified the flaws. He will be desperate to cover his tracks. They agreed to meet at the archive at midnight. The hours dragged by. Nora's mind raced with scenarios, each more frightening than the last. When she finally parked her car a block away from the imposing, dark edifice of the city records building, her hands were shaking. Miguel was waiting by a side entrance, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his phone. He looked older than the photos she'd seen, his hair streaked with gray, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He gave her a grim nod and unlocked the door. The interior was a canyon of towering shelves, smelling of dust and old paper. Their footsteps echoed in profound silence as Miguel led her to the section for new developments. They found the drawer labeled Ethel Tower. Miguel pulled it open. It was empty. A dead end, Nora whispered, her heart sinking into her shoes. He got here first. Maybe not, Miguel said, his eyes scanning the shelves. Sometimes, when a file is actively being referenced or investigated, it's kept in a temporary holding cart. He moved down the aisle, his phone's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Then he stopped. Nora! She hurried to his side. On a metal cart was a single, thick folder. Stamped on its cover was Ethel Tower Foundation and Permits. With trembling fingers, Nora opened it. Inside were the original schematics, signed by Alistair Finch. But as she flipped through the pages, her blood ran cold. These were not the flawed plans. These were perfect, impeccable. The foundation was perfectly aligned, the calculations robust and correct. This doesn't make sense, she stammered. These are flawless. My grandfather was wrong. Miguel's face was pale in the ghostly light. No, Elias is never wrong. He took the schematic and held it up to his phone's light at an angle. Look, beneath Alistair Finch's crisp, professional signature, on the very edge of the paper, was another mark. A tiny, almost imperceptible symbol drawn in faint pencil. It was a simple, elegant drafting compass, the old-fashioned kind, the personal mark of Elias Monroe, and tucked behind the final page was a single, handwritten note on a scrap of paper, the handwriting frantic and familiar. It was from Alistair Finch. He made me change them. Hale threatened my family. The real plans, the dangerous ones, are the only ones that exist now. I'm so sorry. Tell Elias, tell him I failed. Miguel's phone buzzed, shattering the silence. He looked at the screen, his face hardening. That was my contact at the dispatch office. They just got an anonymous tip. There's a reported break-in at this location. He looked at Nora, his eyes wide with alarm. We have to go. Now. They sprinted for the side entrance, but as Miguel pushed the door open, the blinding white light of police cruiser flooded the dark alleyway, pinning them in place. The voice over the loudspeaker was cold and absolute. Freeze! Put your hands in the air. You are under arrest for breaking and entering and the theft of city property. The interrogation room was a sterile, windowless box, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. Nora sat opposite a stern-faced detective, her mind reeling. The stolen file lay on the table between them, a piece of damning evidence. Miguel was in another room, undergoing the same treatment. Your story is a fantasy, Ms. Monroe, the detective said, his tone bored. You and Inspector Ortega conspired to steal confidential city documents to sabotage a major development project. Why? A grudge? Corporate espionage? It's the truth. Nora insisted, her voice cracking. The building is unsafe. The plans were switched. Alistair Finch is missing. You have to listen. We've spoken to Mr. Hale, the detective interrupted. He's provided a very different account. One of a disgruntled employee, influenced by her senile grandfather, conspiring with a corrupt city official. He slid a tablet across the table. On it was a paused video frame from Hale's live stream. It showed Elias, looking confused and frail, his finger hovering uncertainly over the blueprint. It had been expertly edited to remove his damning revelations, making him look like a bumbling old fool. "He's twisting it all," Nora whispered, despair clawing at her throat. Just as the detective was about to continue, the door to the interrogation room opened. A uniformed officer leaned in. "Detective, you need to see this. Now!" In the precinct's main room, all eyes were fixed on a large television screen. A local news channel was broadcasting live. And there, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower construction site, was Elias Monroe. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by a small group of men and women in hard hats and construction vests. The very same staff who had mocked him hours before. Their faces were now set with determination. The news anchor's voice was excited. "We're going live to a stunning development at the controversial Eiffel Tower site, where retired engineer Elias Monroe, a figure at the center of tonight's strange event, is making a public statement." Elias stood tall, his voice clear and strong, amplified by a microphone. He held up a large, rolled schematic. "This," he declared, "is the original, certified foundation plan for the Eiffel Tower, signed by Alastair Finch. A plan that is structurally sound." Then he unrolled another, and this is the plan currently being built from. A forgery, a death warrant. He began to point out the flaws, just as he had in the trailer, but this time for the entire city to see. He explained the misaligned grid, the falsified load reports, the omitted geotech data. He spoke not with anger, but with the devastating clarity of absolute truth. Carter Hale did not make a mistake, Elias said, his gaze piercing the camera lens. He engineered catastrophe. He needed a collapse. He needed the insurance payout. The lives that would be lost were just the cost of doing business. Back in the interrogation room, the detective's phone rang. He answered it, his face turning ashen. "What?" "When? Are you sure?" He hung up and looked at Nora, the smugness gone from his eyes. The district attorney's office just issued a warrant for Carter Hale's arrest, based on new evidence. The door to Nora's room flew open. Miguel Ortega stood there, a relieved look on his face. "It's over, Nora. They found him." "Found who?" she asked, her head spinning. "Alastair Finch," Miguel said. "He wasn't missing. Hale had him held in a private wellness retreat upstate, a fancy prison. He managed to get a message out. He's alive and he's talking. He's confirming everything." Nora felt a surge of triumphant relief. They had won. The truth was out. Hale was finished. As she and Miguel walked out of the precinct, into the cool night air, she saw her grandfather on the steps, surrounded by reporters. He looked tired, but there was a light in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. She ran to him and hugged him tightly. "We did it, grandfather," she whispered. Elias held her close, but his body was tense. He looked over her shoulder at Miguel, who was hanging back, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. The news cameras continued to flash, capturing the moment of victory. But Elias's eyes were not on the cameras, or his granddaughter, or the freed city. They were locked on Miguel Ortega. And in that moment, Elias saw it. Not guilt, not quite, but shadow. A flicker of knowledge that went deeper than it should. Miguel had been Alastair's supervisor on the project initially. He was the one who had fast-tracked the permit approvals for flawed, second set of plans. He had the access, the knowledge, and the authority. As the crowd cheered, Elias leaned close to Nora, his voice a low, horrified whisper meant only for her. "My child," he said, his triumphant smile freezing into a mask of dread. "We didn't win. We just exposed a pawn. The man who really designed this horror. He's standing right behind you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nora pulled back from her grandfather, searching his face for a sign that this was a cruel joke. But his eyes held only a terrible, grim certainty. The cheers of the crowd, the flashing cameras, all of it melted into a distant, muffled roar. She slowly turned her head. Miguel Ortega was still there, his face a carefully constructed mass of relief and solidarity. He gave her a small, reassuring nod. But now, With her grandfather's warning ringing in her ears, she saw the cracks in the facade. The nod was a fraction too slow. The relief in his eyes didn't reach the tense set of his jaw. He had been Alistair's mentor. He had signed off on every single one of Hale's expedited permits without a single query. He had been the one to suggest the archive, the one who knew exactly where to find the file, the one who had gotten them caught. "It was you," she breathed, the words barely audible. Miguel's smile tightened. "Nora, you're in shock. Let's get you and your grandfather somewhere safe." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between Nora and Miguel. The cameras, sensing a new drama, swiveled towards him. "You were my best student, Miguel," Elias said, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "I taught you everything. Not just about stress and load, but about integrity. The integrity of the ground we build on." Miguel's composure finally began to fracture. "This is not the place, Elias." "Oh, but it is," Elias countered, his voice rising. "You knew the plans were switched. You didn't just fast-track them. You buried the originals. You made sure Alistair's perfect design would never see the light of day. Why? Hale paid you off, I assume. But it was always more than money for you, wasn't it, Miguel? It was about legacy. My legacy." The accusation hung in the air, stark and shocking. The reporters were now shoving microphones forward, a forest of recorders. Miguel's eyes glinted with a long-suppressed bitterness. "Your legacy?" he hissed, the caring facade crumbling to dust. "You left the field, Elias. You walked away at the peak of your career to tend your garden and give lectures while the rest of us had to scramble in the dirt you left behind. I was your apprentice, but I was always just Elias's boy. I designed half the city's infrastructure, and they still call me your protege." "So you designed a tombstone?" Elias shot back, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "You created a building that would collapse, just to prove you could? To prove you were my equal? You are a far greater architect than I ever was, Miguel, because you built a lie so perfect it almost killed hundreds." The confession, ripped from him in a moment of pride and rage, was captured by a dozen cameras. Miguel seemed to realize it a second too late. His face went slack with horror. The police, who had been there to protect the heroes, now looked at him with a new, grim purpose. But Miguel was not finished. As two officers moved towards him, he looked past Elias, his eyes locking with Nora's. There was no plea there, only a cold, final warning. "You think this ends with me?" "With Hale," he spat. "This project was too big, too expensive. The money that flowed into it, it came from sources that don't take kindly to failure. We were just the architects, Nora. The investors, they're the real engineers of this ruin." He allowed the officers to cuff him, a strange, resigned calm settling over him. As they led him away, he called out one last, chilling truth over his shoulder. They got what they wanted. The insurance was always the secondary objective. The primary target was the land itself. They never wanted a tower. They wanted a graveyard. And now they have it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of investigations, headlines, and shattered reputations. Carter Hale and Miguel Ortega were charged with a litany of crimes, from fraud and coercion conspiracy to commit murder. The Eiffel Tower site was sealed, a silent, skeletal monument to hubris. But Miguel's final warning festered in Nora's mind. They never wanted a tower. They wanted a graveyard. She and Elias delved into the corporate labyrinth behind Hale Developments, a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. What they uncovered was more sinister than they could have imagined. The land the Eiffel Tower was built on was the last uncontested parcel in a massive urban renewal zone. A catastrophic public failure, a collapse, would devalue the entire district, allowing a shadowy consortium of investors to buy up the land for pennies on the dollar. The tower wasn't the goal, it was the weapon. Its destruction was meant to blight an entire neighborhood, displacing thousands for the profit of a few. The sheer, chilling scale of it took their breath away. Yet, from that poisoned soil, a new seed began to grow. The city, reeling from the scandal, was desperate for a redemption story. Nora, with her grandfather as her guide, proposed something radical. Instead of letting the half-built skeleton of the Eiffel Tower be demolished, they would repurpose it, They would use the existing foundation, the very one Elias had certified as sound, and build something new, something honest. They established the Monroe Fellowship, a program for young, idealistic architects and engineers dedicated to ethical urban design. The project was renamed the Compass Point, a nod to Elias's old drafting symbol. It would be a mixed-use building with affordable housing, public spaces, and its core structure left partially exposed as a teaching tool, a permanent reminder of the fragility of trust. One bright, sunny morning, Elias stood with Nora at the base of the Compass Point. The sound of construction was different now, less frantic, more purposeful. She was a lead architect, her vision shaping the new structure. "It's strange," Nora said, looking up at the soaring framework. "This all started because a cruel man mocked an old man in a shabby jacket." Elias smiled, the California sun warming his wrinkled face. "No, my dear," he said softly. "It started long before that. It started when I chose to retire and left the city in the hands of men who have forgotten that our first duty is not to our ego or our wallet, but to the people who will live and work in the shadows of our creations." He placed a hand on a cool, finished section of the wall. At its base, a simple bronze plaque had been affixed. Nora had insisted on the inscription. It was a promise, an epitaph of the darkness they had uncovered. True architecture begins where ego ends. The building was a testament to that truth. It was a symbol of a battle won, not just against corrupt men, but against the corrosive desire for legacy that had driven them. As Elias looked from the plaque to his granddaughter, who was now directing her team with a confidence he had never seen, he felt a profound peace. The future was no longer a blueprint of fears, but a structure being built, day by day, with integrity and hope. But as the final beam was ceremonially lifted into place, a city official approached Nora, holding a sealed envelope. "This was couriered to the site foreman's office," he said, his expression uneasy. "It's addressed to you. There's no return address." Nora took the heavy, linen envelope. She broke the seal and pulled out a single card. There was no message, just a small embossed symbol. A stylized, predatory bird clutching a set of blueprints in its talons. The shadow of the investors Miguel had warned them about had finally fallen. The battle was over, but the war for the soul of the city had just begun.